Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Bear's Ears, A Human History of America's Most Endangered Wilderness, by David Roberts, narrated by Danny Campbell. 1. The Place and the Promise. In no particular hurry, we hiked along the rim of one of the canyons on Cedar Mesa in southeast Utah. Hundreds of feet below, the stream trickled across slick rock slabs and plunged into grassy hollows. I'd been friends with Vaughn Haydenfeld for more than a decade. Along with his buddy Fred Blackburn, Vaughn had initiated me into the mysteries and glories of this 600-square-mile plateau, an upland quadrangle of pinyon juniper forest scored by a dozen sandstone gorges. The best place in the whole United States, they'd told me when we first met, to find prehistoric rock art panels in unrestored ruins. I'd first arrived in 1992 to research a magazine article about a band of oddball wilderness devotees who were inventing a potent new discipline called reverse archaeology, and lobbying hard for an ethic that Fred called the outdoor museum. Instead of gathering up artifacts for curation in some research facility far from Cedar Mesa, Fred and Vaughn argued you should leave everything in place so that the next hiker who stumbled upon some dazzling relic from the past could share the magic of discovery. I was instantly hooked. Long after my magazine piece was published, I kept returning to Cedar Mesa to prowl with Vaughn and Fred, and I brought my own friends out there to show them the things and places I had found. On this breezy spring day in the late 2000s, as we sauntered along the canyon rim, Vaughn and I paused on promontories to raise our binoculars and train them on the far canyon walls, glassing, as Vaughn called it. In 1995, Vaughn had founded Far Out Expeditions, pledging his life to guiding clients to ancient wonders on Cedar Mesa and beyond. And in 1996, I'd published In Search of the Old Ones, a memoir about my discovery of the prehistoric Southwest, with a chapter titled In Praise of Cedar Mesa. But on his days off, Vaughn loved nothing better than to go out looking for granaries and dwellings and friezes of petroglyphs he'd never seen before. I did the same on my semi-annual pilgrimages to Cedar Mesa, and when we teamed up to search, the game took on a mildly competitive zest. That day we'd already spotted a couple of minuscule granaries far off the ground on the nearly vertical opposite wall. We couldn't see any way to get to them except by rappelling, and the use of ropes to approach prehistoric sites on Cedar Mesa was interdicted by the Bureau of Land Management officials who regulated the place. More to the point was Vaughn's and my certainty that rappelling had not been the way the ancients had reached those two small ledges, on which they had mortared stones with mud to build bins to store the precious corn. I was ready to hike on, but Vaughn had swiveled his binocs far to his right. "Check it out," he said quietly. "Something right under the capstone layer, way back, maybe half a mile." I raised my Leica Trinovids, found the spot, and focused. "Wow," I muttered. "Nice glassing." It would take us another day to hike to the site, as we circled back almost to the head of the canyon before traversing the far rim. On the way, we discovered that the ruin could not be seen from directly opposite it, nor was there any hint of it as we made our way along the capstone layer that guarded the elusive prize. We kept tiptoeing out to the edge of the cliff to peek sideways underneath its brim, never an easy task in the canyon country. As a landmark, we had memorized a pair of water streaks that gleamed silver in the sun on the side of the gorge we'd first walked. They were easy to spot from across, but the locational anchor they offered gave us little help. We later realized that the ruin could be detected only from the vantage point where Vaughn had first seized it in his binocs. That invisibility had been a cardinal advantage for long-ago architects living in daily fear. Just as we began to think we had overshot the site, we found a slope where dirt and stone rubble interrupted the capstone itself. We scrambled down that chute, turned the corner, and there it was. There are very few ruins anywhere in the Southwest that you can't really see until you're only 30 feet away from them. In that instant, Vaughn and I stared, wordless. What we beheld was a single unit of 4 large rooms sharing a clean facade, with a semi-detached portal on the far end. But for a blown-out wall in the nearest room, the whole complex was remarkably well preserved, thanks to the huge natural ceiling that guarded it from rain and wind. The second room had a T-shaped doorway, and next to it a window that had been blocked up, some last-ditch remodel against a gnawing threat. We knew the refuge had been built in the 13th century, or at the very earliest the second half of the 12th. For more than 700 years after the small band who had lived here had fled south in the Great Abandonment, the proud edifice had stood intact and essentially changeless. The most striking thing about the ruin, though, was that it was a solid 2 stories tall, stretching 15 feet from the ruddy bedrock floor to the ochre caprock. Much of the wooden roof of the first story remained intact, and for a single second-story wall the builders had resorted to hakal, sticks and mud interwoven in a daub and wattle lacework. Black soot coated smooth the interior ceiling, the residue of generations of cooking and warming fires. As we poked our heads inside the several rooms, we saw rows of mortared sticks sprouting from the backside of the facade, like so many coat hooks in a closet. 2-story ruins are rare on Cedar Mesa. This one looked like nothing else we had seen among all the dozen canyons. And here in the massive front wall, where the ancients might normally have stacked up whatever stones lay near at hand, the builders instead had conjured an abstract design by alternating clean white sandstone blocks with the usual brown chunks. We could only guess whether a sense of beauty had dictated the design, but to Vaughn and me, the dwelling was beautiful. We were pretty sure that we weren't the first visitors since the 13th century to stumble upon this hidden ruin. For one thing, a paucity of potsherds strewed the runoff slope below the site. But by now, Vaughn had been guiding Cedar Mesa for almost 2 decades, and he'd never overheard the whisper of a rumor about this place. The Citadel and Moon House had long since become vol la voyage stops on the imaginary Michelin tour of Cedar Mesa, even for the most casual dilettantes. Directions to those and a score of other ruins were starting to appear on the internet, complete with GPS coordinates. It was about this time that Vaughn began to grouse about the burgeoning popularity of Cedar Mesa. "The whole place is going to hell," I would hear him say every time we talked. So finding this all but unknown ruin, and such a magnificent one to boot, seemed to prove that, after all, our cherished outback still had plenty of secrets up its sleeve, and that we might yet spend many a year searching for them. The immediate question, though, unspoken during the 2 hours we spent under the capstone, but hanging in our shared excitement, was, what should we do with our discovery? I was pretty sure what Vaughn would do. Take a select few clients to the site, surprising them with yet another prehistoric wonder no other guide could produce. But not just any clients, only those he knew would be struck by genuine awe as they turned the corner below the rubble chute and looked under the overhang. And only those who would never whip out GPSs to fixate the ruin or publish their photos on the internet. And he knew what I would do, write about the place, as I have here, in loving specificity, but without even naming the canyon in which we found it or giving the faintest hints how to get there. And those choices, knee-jerk for both of us by now, raised again the troubling questions that had vexed me since my first excursions onto Cedar Mesa with Vaughn and Fred in 1992. By the time of our late 2000s prowl along the canyon rim, both Vaughn and I would have said that Cedar Mesa was our favorite place on Earth. It was impossible, though, at least for me, to separate the joy of finding the hidden ruin from a kind of covetous appropriation. When I had discovered the Citadel by accident in 1993, it was in the middle of a 4-day solo backpack into Road Canyon, during which I met not a single other hiker. At the bottom of the winding gulf whose intermittent stream flows eastward toward Comb Wash, I headed up a side branch, looked up the sheer wall on my right, and glimpsed 500 feet above the very top edge of a masoned suite of rooms. I actually said out loud, "Oh my God!" It took me 2 hours and 3 false starts to work out a devious path up to that spectacular ruin on the crown of its own slender peninsular fin. By the late 2000s, I'd expected to run into other hikers every time I went back to the Citadel, and one day several years after that, Vaughn took a couple of clients to the site, only to find, count 'em, 65 people in attendance, many jabbering away or spreading out their lunches on the ancient's bedrock porch. He fled. In some way, Vaughn and I wanted to keep our newfound ruin a secret, to be shared only with the right sort. In my case, at least, the elitism and ego-stroking of that impulse were hard to ignore. In The Search of the Old Ones, I had followed the journalistic ethic of the day, which still prevails, by not specifying where I'd found a certain wondrous artifact or ruin. But the popularity of my book inevitably increased Cedar Mesa visitation, especially as some readers treated Old Ones like a treasure map, showing up at Cane Gulch headquarters and demanding that the rangers give them directions, for example, to Robert's Pot. One of my best friends, a writer as passionate about Cedar Mesa as I am, refuses to write anything about the place. It's his way, I suspect, of staying pure, by doing nothing to encourage others to follow his lead into Grand Gulch or Slickhorn Canyon. But he's every bit as competitive as I am, and I've sensed in him the same gloating triumph that shivers my own shoulders when he plucks a perfect dart point out of the sand, or glasses a masoned wall in an obscure cranny. We all want some part of our favorite place on earth to be ours, secreted from the rabble, tucked into the zippered pocket of our self-esteem. Wilderness lovers have always decried the inroads made by latecomers on their landscapes of paradise. New roads are anathema. But Vaughn and I had taken for granted the road from which we started our rim walk that day, as our friend Winston Hurst had not. Growing up in Blanding in the 1950s, Winston had been free to roam on foot all over the outback of Cedar Mesa, seldom encountering another pilgrim, and when civic boosters pushed through the new highway in 1976, blasting a hideous and unnecessary gouge through the Combe Ridge to accommodate even 12-wheelers, he was outraged and depressed. We all lapse easily into Vaughn's malediction that the place we loved is going to hell. Our favorite wilderness should always have stayed just as it was when we first encountered it. If we were born too late to discover the source of the Nile or the South Pole, we came along at just the right moment to explore Cedar Mesa. The illusion dies hard. Like nearly all the prehistoric ruins and rock art panels on Cedar Mesa, the 2-story dwelling that Vaughn and I found hidden beneath the top ledge of the Long Canyon was the work of the Anasazi, or ancestral Puebloans. Those people, originally nomadic, later semi-sedentary, first arrived on the mesa around AD 200, although whether they were the direct descendants of archaic or even Paleo-Indian predecessors, whose artifacts have been found here and there scattered in the pinyon-juniper forest, remains an unsolved question. One measure of the Anasazi passion for this heartland is the fact that shortly before the abandonment, say around AD 1250, more than 1,000 men, women, and children flourished through all 4 seasons on Cedar Mesa. In 2020, the year-round population of the mesa is 0. The greater Bears Ears region extends far beyond Cedar Mesa. On the east, to the dramatic monocline called the Combe Ridge, north, across lofty Elk Ridge and the Dark Canyon Plateau into Beef Basin and Lockhart Basin, along the corridor of Indian Creek, one of the country's premier rock-climbing areas, even west to the detached segment comprising Moki Canyon and the Red Rock Plateau. All these landscapes are virtually uninhabited today, but incredibly rich in antiquities. Alas, the whole region is haunted by a 140-year-long tradition of illegal pot hunting that has ravaged its prehistoric legacy. Yet not long after the last Anasazi bands deserted this homeland, along with all of the Colorado Plateau, Just before 1300, other Native American tribes, principally Utes, Paiutes, and Navajos, moved into the region and made it part of their own homeland. Some would say those tribes overlapped with the Anasazi, but artifactual evidence is hard to find. With the coming of the Spanish in the 18th century and Anglo-Americans in the 19th, the Bears Ears region became a vital place for non-natives. And in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, all of the 20th, and the first 2 decades of the 21st, a protean medley of visitors and settlers with mutually incompatible goals swarmed across this outback. We're talking about gold, silver, and uranium miners, cattlemen and sheep herders, Mormon town builders, oil and gas drillers, hunters, wood gatherers, archaeologists, hikers and backpackers, and aficionados of the Anasazi such as Vaughn and me. Starting in 2015, this stew of contradictory needs and desires reached a boiling point. With President Obama's declaration of the Bears Ears National Monument in December 2016, and President Trump's evisceration of the monument in December 2017, the conflict exploded into the most acrimonious wrangle over a national park or monument in American history. As of this writing, no matter how white-hot the bulletins streaming out of the controversy almost weekly, no final resolution is likely to arrive for years, and then, in all probability, in the verdicts of the courts, only to be further appealed ad infinitum and ad nauseum. Yet all the while the landscape that Vaughn and I and many others love best in the world, and for which others have quite opposite though equally heartfelt plans, lies fragile under the assault. The controversy tends to align around predictable ideological fronts: backpackers versus miners, drillers, and cattlemen, environmentalists versus Mormons, hikers versus ATVers and Jeepers, Democrats versus Republicans, Obama contra Trump. Yet with the Bears Ears, a new phenomenon in America's history of preserving endangered lands emerged. For the first time ever, the initial thrust to declare a region off-limits to development came not from Anglo-dominated interest groups such as the Sierra Club or the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, SUA, but from Native Americans themselves. In 2015, spearheaded by the work of an extraordinary Navajo activist named Mark Maryboy, a group called the Intertribal Coalition proposed an area even larger than what Obama set aside to be protected, not as a national monument, but as an official conservation area. It was a proposal that many of us favored over monument status, since conservation areas never attract the mass tourism that in turn dictates stringent rules that forever change and, we would say, inevitably trivialize the quality of the visitor's experience. Roughly speaking, the Intertribal Coalition aligned its priorities with environmentalists and low-impact recreationists, with the hikers and the Democrats. But this visionary Native American thrust put a new premium on oral history. If the landscape of the Bears Ears was sacred, it was so because of the unwritten but fervent record passed down by word of mouth from one generation to the next of what the place meant to Native people before the first miner or Mormon or surveyor or archaeologists arrived on the scene. By 2020, many articles and 6 books about the Bears Ears had been published. Nearly all of them leaned toward the environmentalist and Native American perspective. Several were anthologies of testimony from folks ranging from natives to archaeologists to artists and poets and guides, all pleading for the restoration of Obama's monument. It's not my intention in this book to add to this chorus. Instead, I hope to glide through the centuries as I evoke the complex human history of the magnificent Bears Ears landscape. Embedded in that history are all kinds of poignant ironies and surprising contradictions. Gold miners and cowboys, for instance, preceded the first true recreationists by half a century. Writers as diverse as Zane Grey, Edward Abbey, and Tony Hillerman embraced this wilderness, but saw quite different epiphanies written in Cliff and Canyon and Butte. Outlaw cronies of Butch Cassidy fled posses across the plateaus or lay low in canyon nooks. Archaeologists worked in cahoots with pot hunters. Other pot hunters committed suicide. Navajos who escaped the genocidal Long Walk in 1863-64 hid out for 5 years in the Bears Ears. Cliven Bundy's son Ryan helped foment a sagebrush rebellion showdown in one of the canyons that ended up sending a county commissioner to jail. Mormons regularly pushed their jeeps along the trail first blazed by the Hole in the Rock expedition of 1879-80, the LDS founding myth of southeastern Utah. The tragicomic saga of the last Indian War in the United States unfurled toward its denouement on the eastern edge of Cedar Mesa. And Vaughn and I no doubt will head back to Bears Ears year after year, searching for things we've never seen before, until we are so decrepit we have to crawl. So much partisan acrimony, so many broadsides and polemics have already been generated by Obama's stunning creation of the National Monument and by Trump's equally stunning destruction of it, that the weary listener might well complain, who needs another book about the Bears Ears? Even though the controversy crystallizes a fundamental American schism in values that clusters around nations of land and property and wilderness and development, a schism that spans more than 2 centuries of our tenure on this continent, from sea to shining sea, no manifesto is likely to clarify the mess. No Rachel Carson or John Muir is going to emerge to proclaim the just solution. And whatever becomes of the Bears Ears after the final verdicts dribble out of the courts years from now will leave the losers embittered for generations to come. What I hope to do in this book is write a human history of this magnificent tract of canyons, plateaus, hoodoos, and basins. Lest this very idea conjure up some dreary textbook, with chapters marching chronologically from Paleo-Indian through Ute and Navajo, on to Mormon settlers and the outdoor recreation industry, I promise to avoid that taxonomic straitjacket. I intend instead to jump around among the ages, muse on some of the heroes and villains of that history while ignoring others, and seize upon such tangled outbursts in the record as the pot-hunting career of Earl Shumway, or Posey's doomed war, or the mythic Hejira of the Hole in the Rock expedition. I'll try to bring the characters to life, not the lawsuits. A model for this book is Wallace Stegner's Mormon Country, 1942, that deft and rambling grab bag of essays that somehow captures the essence of the culture of the Latter-day Saints in the landscape they chose for their new Zion. Nor will I hesitate to interleave the passages about dramatic events and outlandish movers and shakers with accounts of my own adventures in the Bears Ears landscape, like the episode that opens this chapter. After all, this is the part of the world that I love most, the outback that if I were told I had only one more chance to see, I'd grab with both feet without a thought for any other choice. For me, the human history of the Bears Ears is inextricably tied up with the nearly 3 decades I've spent wandering, camping, and prowling across it. It's where I head instinctively when I sense the need to renew my sense of wonder. And wonder is the font of curiosity. 2. In Search of a Lost Race. As the Intertribal Coalition and its allies began to put together their proposal to protect the vast backcountry domain they hoped to save from developers, they struggled to give it a name. The analogies of other Utah parks and monuments were at once helpful and frustrating. Canyonlands and arches were apt names for national parks dominated respectively by narrow corridors and slots enclosed by towering cliffs, and by natural bridges and windows worn by wind and erosion into the sandstone. Grand Staircase Escalante, on the other hand, was an awkward mouthful, especially because even die-hard visitors had a hard time identifying just what and where the Grand Staircase was. An amalgam of the place names of the component landscapes of the endangered region, Comb Ridge, Cedar Mesa, Elk Ridge, Dark Canyon, Beef Basin National Monument, was obviously not going to work. As early as 2012, the Navajo elders and other participants in the effort to preserve this wilderness, led by Mark Maryboy, had incorporated as Utah Dene Bekeya, UDB, borrowing a phrase in their own language that translates as the people's sacred lands. According to Gavin Noyes, an Anglo who is the executive director of Salt Lake City-based UDB, Dene Bekeya reverberates with deeper, subtler meanings. It signifies the relationship of all people to the earth through the soles of our feet, says Noyes. That meaning is profoundly better than trying to pronounce it as an Anglo. As a name for the proposed conservation area, though, Dene Bekeya threatened to seem too arcane to non-Native Americans, and it was off-putting to members of other tribes, such as the Utes and Hopi, because it seemed to give strong priority to the Navajo. Actually, recalls Noyes, everyone disliked the monument name from the beginning. Nobody could say it, and there was no way it was ever going to get the massive campaign behind it that we needed. It was Noyes who came up with Bears Ears as a proper appellation. What turned me on to the idea of the Buttes was the effort to get all the tribes involved, he says. Utes had never heard the name Cedar Mesa, even though some of them had been born on it, and other tribes from farther away always zeroed in on the Buttes. Eventually I studied the map, analyzed the topo lines, and realized you could see the land of the entire monument proposal from the top of the ears. Then I asked all the tribes I knew for the name in their languages, and asked if it was suitable. Amazingly, they all said their names meant Bears Ears in English, and the English version united everyone. In the spring of 2017, after President Obama had announced the creation of Bears Ears National Monument, tourists began arriving from all over the country to see what all the fuss was about. Many of them alighted at Recapture Lodge in Bluff, where owner Jim Hook, my friend for the last 25 years, was happy to give directions. "How do I get to the Bears Ears?" they asked Jim, who pulled out a map and indicated State Highways 261 and 95 and the dirt road that climbs north to the top of Elk Ridge. With a mixture of rue and mirth, Jim later told me, "You know how muddy that road gets in spring? Some of them got their cars stuck trying to get up to the plateau, and the ones who made it came back and complained. So what's the big deal about the monument? The Bears Ears are just a couple of bumps." With Coronado's massive entrada from 1540 to 1542, for the first time Europeans made a major incursion into what would become the American Southwest. A few years earlier, the lost quartet of Spaniards led by Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who, during 8 years of wandering and enslavement by Indians, managed to cross the continent from Florida's Gulf Shore to Mexico's Pacific coast, traversed southern New Mexico somewhere near the pueblo of Zuni. Their tales spurred the ambition of New Spain to explore and conquer the unknown lands to the north. In 1598, Don Juan de Onate defeated several tribes and set up a Spanish colony near the upper Rio Grande, moving its capital to Santa Fe in 1610. Despite this stronghold in today's New Mexico, the governors and Franciscan priests in charge of the colony had such shaky control over the Puebloans, whom they had suppressed and turned into servants and Catholics, that for almost 2 centuries no real effort to probe farther north and west was launched. It was only with the establishment of Spanish missions along the California coast in the 1760s and 70s that it became desirable to blaze a trading route from Santa Fe to Monterey. This grand campaign was entrusted to a pair of inexperienced explorers, the Franciscan padres Silvestre Velez de Escalante and Francisco Atanasio Dominguez. Their epic 7-month, 1,700-mile journey in 1776 was a failure, in that the small team of 12 never came close to reaching California, but it remains one of the greatest voyages of European discovery in the New World. My 2019 book, Escalante's Dream, recounts the 40-day retracing of the Dominguez Escalante route that my wife Sharon and I undertook in 2017. As far as I can ascertain.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?